you go. All right. Why urban wildlife matters? Yes, even rats. And yes, I am actually going to talk about rats, but not just rats. But I think they're good as a test case. So if I manage to convince you of some things about rats, probably you'll be more likely to care about some of these other creatures out there. So as of 2018, the United Nations estimated that about just 1% of the Earth's land surface was occupied by urban spaces, but still 55% of the world's population lived on that land. According to some other sources, it's closer to 80 or 85%, and it's just projected to keep rising over the next few years. So eventually, most of the world will be living in urban areas, even though urban areas themselves don't occupy that much of the Earth's surface. It's a little hard. I tried to find some sources, but to get a sense of how many animals live in urban and suburban areas. But just to get a provisional handle on the issue, that's just wild mammals. And so there are various calculations of the biomass of wild mammals. It's relatively well known, if you're familiar with the topic, that the biomass of wild mammals is dwarfed by the biomass of animals that we have domesticated, whether we count the companion animals or, of course, farm animals. So most of the biomass of mammals on the Earth is composed of domesticated animals and human beings, right? And so you could zoom in on either the wild marine mammals or the terrestrial mammals to see which ones occupy most of the biomass. Of course, that's just talking about the biomass. You could wonder about the number of species or the number of individuals, and most of the talk would be about the individuals themselves. So I actually learned that fairly recently. It's completely amazing to me. So that relatively light green bar here is just bats. 60% of the individual mammals in the world are bats. Just let that sink in. 60% of the individual mammals in the world are bats. Of course, they're tiny, so in terms of biomass, they're not that huge. Like you have that little rectangle here. The ungulates, including the deer, for instance, occupy a lot of the mammal biomass. But you can see that in terms of number of species, in terms of individuals, and in terms of biomass, rodents, which will include rats and squirrels and so on and so forth, are still fairly well represented. Well, I was going to ask you, but then you have the answer now. It's hard to actually count the number of rats that there are in the world, so we can just calculate, from extrapolation. So first I read that it was a 1-to-4 ratio. Apparently, recently we discovered it's closer to a 1-to-3 ratio of rats to people in New York City. So there is about 3 million rats in New York City. So if you think that New York City is typical as a large metropolitan area for the number of rats that live there, you can roughly calculate the number of rats you would expect to find in cities in the world, but the answer is there's a lot of them. Okay. All right, so here's what I want to do today with you. I want to convince you of a few things, and perhaps you're already convinced. If that's the case, just tag along for the ride. But I want to show that there's probably more urban animals than you think. They probably matter more, morally speaking, than you think. And we probably have more impact on their lives than we tend to think. Right? So these are the three ways in which I think they matter. So the topic of urban wildlife was, until relatively recently, little explored in philosophy, especially animal ethics, but some recent work has changed the landscape. But in the social sciences, more generally in the last 2 decades at least, there's been a lot of exciting work. So it's not uncommon now in a typical bookstore to find a small handful of books, both popular and academic, focused on urban ecology, urban wildlife, urban animals, and so on, animals in your backyard, and so on and so forth. So that's exciting. So here are the steps. It's going to be a relatively long and winding and bumpy road, but again, buckle up, should be fun. And there's going to be a lot of pictures. The talk itself is a little bit big picture and programmatic because I'm catering to a variety of audiences here, so I don't want to do something that's overly technical. The philosophical content is going to be relatively light, and there's going to be tons of pictures, but it's going to take you to many places. So I'm going to start introducing you to our buddies here, the urban wildlife, and their variety, and then I'm going to list a number of the typical impacts that human activity has on their lives. I'm going to show you why it matters from at least two main perspectives, and then I'm just going to outline some potential solutions. That's the part that's most speculative, but I think also the most exciting. And by the way, I'm going to talk about those several times in the talk. What you can see here is what we call a wildlife crossing. So that's a bridge. It's one kind of wildlife crossing. It aims at allowing wildlife to cross roads safely. All right, introductions. I'm not going to talk about those guys, cats and dogs, who live with us. That's my recently passed away cat, Mouchette, who lived in a city, who actually has lived in many cities, Paris, or actually suburb of Paris first, Paris then, New York, Chicago, Sarasota, and then she died. So that's an urban animal, but that's not the urban animals I'm going to be talking about. Neither am I going to talk about companion dogs. All right, so let's try to categorize urban wildlife. So we all have some typical pictures of wild animals in mind. We all have some typical pictures of domesticated animals in mind, both companion animals and farm animals. And in between, there's a range of species that can be wild but captive, held in zoos, in aquaria, for instance, species that we keep in labs, and species that we keep in our homes, or that have escaped our homes and have gone feral or stray, including feral cats and stray dogs. All right, so these are in-between cases, which we're already relatively familiar with. But typically, when we think about prototypical or characteristic species of urban wildlife, we tend to consider them as pests or nuisance or vermin for at least many, if not most of them. And that's going to include a range of taxonomic groups, right? So we're going to have mammals, we're going to have birds, reptiles, and amphibians. We're going to have insects and other invertebrates in the list here. All right, that's an urban animal. That's the recently deceased, actually, I learned that with a lot of sadness a few months ago, P22, who was made famous thanks to that amazing picture, was one of the famous mountain lions in the LA region. I'm going to talk about those guys a little more later. That's an urban animal. That's a wild animal living in an urban area. Same thing for here, you have parakeets in London. One of the largest bat colonies, urban bat colonies in the US in Austin, Texas. A deer in London, a squirrel in Montreal, pigeons in Venice, and rats, of course. All right, you'll be reassured to know that Charleston is not amongst the 50th rattiest cities in the US. Yes, Greenville is amongst them, apparently, but that's the only one in the state. Maybe Charlotte is one of them in North Carolina. But Charleston has rats, of course, like any other urban area, but not in the top 50. Anyone can guess what city is the rattiest city in the US? Oh. Chicago. Chicago is the rattiest city in the US, followed by LA and New York. All right. But there are rats in Charleston, and they seem to cause exactly the same sorts of problems that they cause everywhere. So people consider them to be vermin or nuisance. They invade our spaces, or homes, or restaurants, or businesses, or offices, and so on and so forth. All right, that's the famous pizza rat in the subway in New York. Everybody has, and if you have not, you should see the video of that clever rat stealing a pizza slice. So one of the interesting things about rats is you could tell the history of it. That's a wonderful book by Robert Sullivan. You can tell the history of a city by looking at its rats, the history of the rats, through the origins of the city, or at least through the origins of the modern city after the settlers came in. So strongly recommended, but you could tell similar stories about other cities and looking at different animals, right? So Chicago has a particular history with coyotes, so there's a number of organizations, also scientists at the Lincoln Park Zoo working on coyotes. They have a fairly healthy population out there. Chicago is also fairly unique among the large metropolitan areas because there's a lot of actually green spaces within or embedded within the city, perhaps more than you would find in New York or LA. Although I'll talk more about LA later. But the Chicago Tribune itself has been actually quite good in showcasing the coyotes and actually speaking on their behalf. Urban animals more generally, but coyotes in particular. And finally, you could tell the story of Toronto with the raccoons, right? The Canadians and perhaps other people call them trash pandas, which I think is both affectionate and a little condescending. But they're an interesting case study because people have realized quite quickly that the raccoons in general are very smart. But there are studies now showing that urban raccoons tend to be even smarter than their rural counterparts. So that's a form of adaptation, and cities tend to attract and then select for some kind of smarts amongst many animals, including raccoons. Right? So they've had to outsmart the raccoons with clever ways of securing or trash cans and so on and so forth. But we all have them in our backyards around here as well. They were one of my favorite animals. Pigeons, of course, are ubiquitous, so you find them everywhere. Almost everywhere in the world, like rats, and we can also tell interesting stories about those cities through the lens of the pigeons. All right, so here are some more pictures of animals we may encounter in different urban areas, including red foxes, coyotes, black bears, wild boars. And if you travel across the world, different cities will have different kinds of urban animals. So I've listed a number of animals that we're all familiar with to an extent, but if you live in other parts of the world, you may be more familiar with macaques. If you live in India, also leopard in Mumbai. The leopards in Mumbai are here. They are known to have killed a few people, but not that many. You have the baboons in Cape Town in South Africa, and of course you have the cows everywhere in India. But the general idea here is that they're just around you. They're next door. Just like they're everywhere. Every city has urban wildlife. It's going to vary what kind of animals you're likely to encounter in different cities, but everywhere you go, you're likely to find them, even though we tend not to look at them the way we look at our companion animals, animals in labs, animals in farms, or more charismatic fauna in the wild. So they're hidden in plain view, just like out there for you to see, even though they tend to be the animals we like to look at. And so there's a kind of love-hate relationship between urbanites like us and cities on the one hand, and urban animals on the other hand. So like I said, some kinds of animals tend to be attracted by cities, right? And so there's a kind of selection for certain traits amongst those species. Some species are very generalist and adaptive, like raccoons, and so they will tend to be, pigeons for instance, they will tend to be attracted by most kinds of urban areas. At the same time, there's lots of threats in cities that those animals are vulnerable to. And so sometimes we talk about ecological traps to describe the phenomenon whereby those animals are attracted to urban areas because they provide them with shelter, food, slightly higher temperatures, protection from predation, and so on and so forth. And yet at the same time, they get stuck because they become dependent on those environments and some food sources. They can be exposed to risks that they haven't adapted to. They're exposed to windows, construction, cars, pollution, and so on and so forth. Yeah? So that particular meta-analysis actually showed that it's ambivalent. Like it's not generally or necessarily true that all urban animals will be trapped in those ecological traps, even though that may be true for some of them. I've written myself about that issue, so in those two papers I've talked about urban wildlife, and I've made the case that in at least some cases urban animals can be considered captive because they are trapped by urban environments, but I'm closing over that for now. All right, so I've shown you a lot of pictures. I've talked about a few different kinds of species. There's different ways we could categorize urban animals. Here's a taxonomy I borrowed from Claire Palmer in one of the seminal articles on the topic. So there are the animals that you're less likely to encounter. because they avoid us. Right? So they might be nocturnal, or they might just be at the outskirts or edges of town, and so you're less likely to encounter them. But there's also the animals we consider nuisance and that we remove just even before we settle in some places. So development, for instance, will tend to eliminate either intentionally or unintentionally a number of populations that you would have encountered in the previously green spaces. But then there are the animals that you will encounter a lot because they don't mind being around us, and to an extent we don't mind them being around us too much, right? So the scavengers, including the pigeons and perhaps the ducks and the geese and so on and so forth. There's a question to what extent we actually tolerate things like raccoons and squirrels and rats, but you could also include them amongst the commensals and or the scavengers. Third category would include any animal that has migrated to or colonized a space, and so that it can include a wide range of species depending on where you live. And you may think that animals that are now scavengers or commensals were once migrants or colonizers in those spaces. So all of that is going to depend on the time scale you're using. A slightly less interesting category, but still worth mentioning, is animals, especially exotics, that have been introduced in urban spaces, sometimes for display, that could be in stores or in zoos, or kept as pets that have been released, right? So remember one of the earlier pictures, you can see the parakeets in London, we have them in Paris as well. There's a number of exotic species that have been released in urban areas. So that's not in Palmer, but another or two more helpful ways of categorizing or distinguishing between different kinds of urban animals is distinguishing between the generalist and the opportunist on the one hand. So the ones that will tend to flourish or at least adapt fairly well to a variety of environments and environmental changes versus the niche specialist, right, who will do well in specific and sometimes rather narrow set of circumstances. So those animals, for instance, will be more vulnerable to changes in temperatures, changes in precipitation, changes in the kind of habitat, and so on and so forth. And another distinction that I like is between synanthropic and what we may call misanthropic species, those that tend to not mind being around us and those that actually want to avoid us. And there's interesting work by Seth Magel and colleagues on coyotes, for instance, especially in Chicago, showing that coyotes have an interesting combination of traits. So they're behaviorally misanthropic, right? So they tend, as individuals in their daily behaviors, to not want to be around us, but they're demographically synanthropic. Like they have higher population densities and better reproduction growth or population growth in more urbanized and more populous human areas. So they tend to do well as populations around human beings, but as individuals, they don't tend to like being around us all that much, right? So that's another distinction you could draw between how the populations behave and how psychologically or behaviorally those individuals could be characterized. All right, that was the introductions. So that's a lot of different creatures we could talk about. Now I'm going to list a number or the main kinds of impacts that I think we, through urbanization and development and just living in cities, we tend to have on their lives. First of all, and perhaps the most well-known when you think about rats, or raccoons, is control. The control we exercise and sometimes impose on those animals. I saw that just this morning exiting the parking garage just off of St. Philip's and George Street, that very cynically called rodent cafe, which is just basically a trap for rats with poison inside. That's definitely not a human way of catching rats, but it at least has the advantage of having a funny name. So that's the kind of control. Like we control population through traps, poisons, and sometimes other forms of barriers that will exclude from certain spaces animals that may be interested in occupying those spaces. Everywhere in the US and perhaps elsewhere in the world, you will encounter at different states, federal, state, county, city, animal control agencies, some of which will be more geared towards protecting wildlife, other ones will be more geared towards eliminating such wildlife. But typically, they have a sort of monopoly over handling and managing the populations that may cause trouble and conflicts with human beings. I think that specific case, I found that in an article on a coyote that was found roaming the streets of downtown Chicago, so that's why you see that. All right, so other forms of control here, including forms of exclusion with those spikes that serve to prevent pigeons from perching on ledges on buildings, but also other forms of more tacit forms of control, including regulations and policies that prevent us from engaging with those animals in certain ways, including forbidding feeding the pigeons. All right, your tax dollars at work. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, that's just like an article from a few years ago, data from 2008, and I don't think I have any reason to think the numbers have decreased since then. But there's, overall millions of creatures that are killed every year by federal wildlife services to resolve conflict with human beings in general, whether for business purposes, matters of convenience, sanitary purposes, property damage, conflict with other creatures that may be protected, and so on and so forth. You name it. All right, so much for control. Now, under this relatively vague umbrella, I'm going to list a number of environmental changes that can be attributed to human activity that have impacts on those animals' lives. All right, so these are some of the most common threats to urban wildlife in urban and suburban areas. Reflective windows. Okay? Literally millions of birds every year are killed in cities because of reflective windows. Right? So the birds tend to be disoriented and sometimes just don't notice that there are windows when they're flying through them, and they can be killed on impact or can die minutes or hours after the impact. But that's a neglected but very important source of negative welfare, suffering, and death amongst flying creatures. Poison, of course, I've mentioned the rats already. They have more than the targeted impact they're supposed to have. So they're going to kill the creatures you want to catch, of course. So they're going to kill the rats, for instance, but they're going to kill a number of other creatures, right? So sometimes poison can be distributed in ways that will be ingested by your target species, but that target species may escape and then be eaten by other creatures, right? So birds of prey, for instance, will prey on the rats, and then you have the poisons circulating through the trophic chain. Right? And because of well-known phenomenon of biomagnification, the more you climb up the ladder of the trophic chain, the more concentration you have of this poison. So they have disastrous ecological effects beyond the targeted species themselves. And then infrastructure generally has a lot of impact beyond the windows. So that includes all of the barriers to animal movement and mobility. Fences, roads, I'm going to talk more about the roads later, and buildings. Roads are actually, so especially collisions because of vehicles, are one of the leading causes, if not the first cause of vertebrate mortality, wild vertebrate mortality in the world, or at least in the US, I think. I say why? Well, because if we include farm animals, then those numbers are going to dwarf the number of animals killed on roads. But still, roads kill millions of animals every year. All right, another kind of impact, so that was just like a few weeks ago in the Chicago Tribune again, the impact of increasing temperatures due to global warming mainly in urban areas on urban wildlife. So in particular in Chicago, and that's going to include our friends, the coyotes. So that's going to be more of an issue for those animals, remember, that are not generalists, but tend to be specialists. And so those that tend to have more difficulty adapting to changes over time, or changes that happen more quickly that they can adapt to. So that's going to be another interesting avenue for research, how we can accommodate the potential migration and displacements of those animals as a result of climate change within cities, where we know that sometimes the effects of global warming can be amplified through the so-called urban heat island effect. All All right, so there's a lot of research being done in urban ecology to assess the impacts that cities and their various aspects have on the lives of animals. Right? So I haven't mentioned everything so far, but there's interesting work being done on the impact of the effects of urbanization, especially light pollution, noise pollution, pollutants, on cancer rates in wild species. And it's a little bit of a puzzle. So that particular paper suggests that a lot of those factors may have a positive, which means detrimental impact on cancer rates in many wild urban populations. But there's an interesting puzzle in that urban populations, or animals of urban populations, tend to live longer than their rural counterparts. So part of the increase in cancer rates could actually be explained by the fact that those creatures tend to live longer, and so they have more time for cancers to develop. Right? So there's a sort of trade-off. Like they live longer lives, and therefore they're more likely to develop cancers. But that doesn't mean that cancer is good for them. Right? Like I said, interesting work being done on the effects of noise pollution and light pollution as well, both of which are relative or were until recently relatively neglected sources of impacts on animal health. So it's not just disturbance like on our aesthetic enjoyment of the night sky, for instance, or quiet environments. These are actual disturbances on animal health. And these are just sad pictures of birds after collisions with buildings in New York City. All right. So I've reviewed a number of the impacts our urban environments can have on animals. Control, anthropogenic changes. One I want to focus on in a little more detail is habitat loss and fragmentation. So these are just like over time for examples of changes in large urban areas where you see the amount of green spaces decreasing, so habitat being destroyed. The exception being here Las Vegas, so you seem to have a lot more green spaces, but that's because there's been a lot more colonization of desert spaces. So, but these are actually urban areas. And so those kinds of development tend to trap, again, literally, animals within certain habitat ranges, and so constrain them in much narrower territories or ranges than they typically need to flourish. Partly because they have to cross roads, and for some animals, it's fairly difficult to cross the road safely, especially if you're slow. So I just read, came out a few weeks ago, a wonderful book by Ben Goldfarb called Crossings on Road Ecology, documenting the various impacts that roads, both outside urban areas and in urban areas, but also connecting different urban areas, have on the lives of animals. So it's a little gruesome in that it includes a lot of descriptions of roadkills and collisions and so on and so forth, but it's really, really fascinating. So I strongly recommend it. And it just made me more aware of the impact that roads themselves have on animals. So just some examples here. And then I want to talk a little more about those mountain lions in LA. Good news is, we'll start with the good news. So the recent Infrastructure Act that was voted by the Biden administration includes some millions of dollars. That's a tiny fraction of the whole package, but still some millions of dollars dedicated to wildlife protection, especially construction of wildlife crossings. So that's going to be good news, and you're going to see why that is actually good news. Right? So some of these folks get stuck on the mountains. So here is the distribution of different subpopulations of mountain lions, especially around the Santa Monica Mountains near LA. And the worry for them, as you might have guessed, is this. That's 101, right? That's a big freeway. And very, very few mountain lions there cross the road for understandable reasons. It's very dangerous. And for the few of them who have tried, very few have succeeded. Some of them have, right? And they have made the news for that. But most of those who tried actually just like die because of collisions. All right, so that's one worry. They have to cross the road. And why do they want to cross the road? Well, because they need habitat and because some of them need to mate, right? And so they want to cross the road to find partners, but that's very hard for them. Yeah. So lots of collisions. So these are actually populations that are at risk of extinction because there's more difficulty for them to breed, and therefore there's more inbreeding. So one of the, I think actually P22 mated and had offspring with one, if not more, of his daughters and then granddaughters. So there was a lot of inbreeding. So there's a, for many of those populations now, genetic bottlenecks that are pushing the species, or those populations at least, to the brink of extinctions. So on those various maps, you can see some of the crossings that are most dangerous for them right then. All right, so two of them, so you have 101 up north here, and then further south, I-15 is another one. So there are going to be areas, priority areas for the construction of wildlife crossings, which will allow us to connect the populations across those different ranges here. All right, that's a picture of, it's actually under construction now, of one of those crossings over 101. All right, so why does all of this matter? I'm going to go back to the rats fairly soon. So there's two paths you to take here, depending on your affinities, let's say. So maybe you care, and maybe you care about both things, but maybe you care about animals because you care about individuals and you think they can have good lives, they can flourish, and some of our ethical responsibilities involve making sure that we don't prevent them from leading flourishing lives. If that's the avenue you want to take, then you're considering those animals as individuals who have moral status. The other avenue you could take is you care about ecosystems or ecological systems more generally, or species, and you think that urbanization, urban development, and the impacts of cities in general are threatening some of those populations or some of those species or some of those ecosystems. Animals are part of those ecosystems, and therefore, to the extent that they contribute to those ecosystems, you should care about them. Now, I happen to think that those two perspectives are perfectly compatible, but sometimes there may be conflicts. It's not entirely clear, for instance, that having a ratio of 1 to 3 rats to people in New York City is critical to flourishing of the New York ecosystem, right? But if you care about rats for the sake of individual welfare, if you care about their lives as sentient individual creatures, then you might have a clash between the ecological perspective and the individualist perspective. But I think in most cases, those two will be compatible. So let's start with the latter, the ecological perspective. So let's start by recognizing what many urbanists and urban ecologists have recognized, that cities are actually kinds of ecosystems. So you can understand cities as ecosystems, and I'll say more about that shortly. But they're a special kind of ecosystem, and perhaps many ecosystems are like that now. They're social ecological systems. So the acronym is SES. That's meant to recognize the fact that the functioning of ecosystems cannot be disentangled from the actions of human beings and institutions within those ecosystems. So those things are entangled. But so if we approach cities as social ecological systems, then it seems like questions we could raise about social justice within cities, if we're not being speciesist and we don't want to be excluding the lives of other animals, we'll have to include how social justice can be inclusive of animal lives within those cities. So in a nutshell, thinking about just cities will entail thinking about ways we can devise and design and revise our cities to make them more than human or multi-species just cities. All right, so let's start with Jane Jacobs, the famous urbanist who criticized urban planners in the second part of the 20th century, known in part for claiming that cities are best understood as problems of organized complexity. Right? What she means by that is literally that cities are like ecosystems. There are, more precisely, complex adaptive systems. So they are self-organized. There's a kind of organic growth within cities that actually urban planning, the top-down form of urban planning, is at odds with. They are diverse, almost of necessity. They develop organically over time, and so they include the diversity of niches for different kinds of populations, for different kinds of activities, different kinds of lives can be lived within cities, and different livelihoods as well. The different parts of those systems, like the parts of any ecosystem, are interdependent, so there is an interdependence between the whole and the parts, and the different parts themselves, and the processes within those parts, within those, the whole. And it's a complex system, right? So you can't understand the system as a whole by just looking at the isolated or atomized interactions between the different parts. Like you have to look at the system as a whole and how it's built as a network or system of interactions and processes rather than just the aggregation of individuals bumping into each other. So that's what it means to look at the city as a complex adaptive system. Now, as you've guessed, it's not just an ecosystem involving interactions between human beings, it will also include interactions between human and non-human beings. And like any kind of ecosystem, the cities can be more or less vulnerable and or fragile or more resilient. And what we want are resilient ecosystems, and therefore we want resilient cities. One thing that helps for that goal is having more diverse cities with a greater variety of species, a greater variety of niches, functions, and so on and so forth. All right, so cities are those self-organized systems that are determined by the behavior of humans who follow rules and sometimes break those rules, cars who also follow the rules and sometimes break those rules, and wildlife who don't seem to follow our rules and sometimes cause trouble. But the behaviors of all of those parts, the humans, the cars, the buildings, the wildlife, are interdependent and mutually responsive. So wildlife will respond to feedback we give them, including through control and through protection exchanges, sometimes by welcoming them. Think about feeding the ducks, feeding the pigeons, versus trapping the rats and the raccoons. And we also respond to them, right? So we will sometimes build our houses or design our streets or parks, thinking of the ways they could impact, include and or exclude certain kinds of wildlife. Right? So there's going to be tons of interactions at multiple levels, and all of those things are going to change over time. Much more recently, Nicolas wrote a book called City Living that was published, I think, a year ago or maybe 2 years ago, where she also makes the case for understanding cities as ecosystem, and she has a short section actually on urban animals. But I'm going to skip over that in the interest of time. Just wanted to emphasize the central thesis of her book, which is that there's a sort of mutual co-constitution between urban spaces and the urban dwellers. So the material spaces we inhabit shape our lives, but we also shape the cities themselves, and you can't understand either of those things independently. But the interesting thing, of course, is that urban dwellers will include, including according to Kukla, some urban wildlife. Cities, they write, that have developed slowly and organically have been shaped by the micro-interactions of humans, companion animals, and wild urban animals with each other and with the environment into specific sorts of spaces supporting specific sorts of agency. Skipping over the territory part. And here's another inspiring quote from Iris Meyer and Young. The paper, I think, is called City Life and Difference in 1991 or something like that. I propose an ideal of city life as a vision of social relations affirming group difference. As a normative ideal, city life instantiates social relations of difference without exclusion. Different groups dwell in the city alongside one another, of necessity interacting in city spaces. City life, as an openness to unassimilated otherness, however, represents only an unrealized social ideal. Many social injustices exist in today's cities. That's the 40-minute mark. Great. Young was not talking about urban wildlife. I have no idea whether or not she had that in mind when she wrote that, but part of what I'm trying to do here is convince you that when we think about that ideal of a city life involving issues of social justice or social injustice, we should bear in mind that the interactions that constitute the city will include interactions with urban wildlife. Is this going to look like that when it goes well? Probably not. I don't know, and I don't know if we would want cities to look like that. Okay? But the point I'm trying to make is that cities would need to look a lot different if we were to try to achieve that ideal in a multi-species kind of way. So I've talked about the ecological approach. That one is going to be slightly quicker. It's the idea simply that other animals, including rats, have moral status. And there's an economical approach you could take here, depending on the characteristics you think they have. They can be sentient, so capable of pleasant and unpleasant experiences, capable of suffering in particular. They can have complex or more or less complex forms of agency. They are capable of social behavior. They play critical roles in the biotic community or in ecosystems, and all of them are to an extent affected by human activity. All of these, I think, are not mutually exclusive and plausible sources of moral consideration. Like, they give rise to some reasons for you to care about those creatures. I'm setting aside, for the sake of simplicity, but I'm happy to talk more about that later, invertebrates about which there's a lot more uncertainty whether they're sentient or capable of agency and so on and so forth. But they, of course, are urban creatures as well. So here are some reasons why we don't like them. These could be aesthetic or psychological reasons, so they trigger in us fear or disgust, or they inspire or cause disorder and conflicts. There's tons of prudential reasons having to do with property damage, costs to the economy, sanitary reasons having to do with public health, convenience and comfort, and so on and so forth. But of course, these are not morally relevant criteria of moral status. Like, we don't tend to think that we should give more or less rights to people just on the basis of the sort of aesthetic and psychological reactions we have to them, or whether or not they inconvenience us. Yeah? So these reasons could factor in your decision making as long as considering those creatures as having moral status takes priority. But many of the ways I've highlighted in which we interact with those animals so far run afoul of the idea that they have moral status, including the way we treat rats. Right? So rats have been shown to be capable of social play, laughter. That's Jan Panksepp, who first discovered that rats were capable of a kind of laughter when you tickle them. They're capable of reliving memories of past experiences, planning ahead, reciprocity, complex problem solving, and perhaps most importantly, empathy. Here you have a lab rat, trying to help a conspecific that's trapped in a tunnel. So rats, I think, are really a test case for the inconsistency of our attitudes. Right? So we can keep them as pets and take good care of them. We can keep them in labs. They're one of the most widely used species of vertebrates now in the world in labs for scientific research and other forms of experimentation. And to an extent, we take good care of them because they're important tools or instruments. But then there's also the rats we treat as pests, like in our streets in particular. Funny or not funny thing being that rats, including the rats that we keep captive in labs, are not covered by the Animal Welfare Act. Right? So according to the definition of an animal in the Animal Welfare Act, amongst other species, rats and mice are not animals. And that includes, it's very hard to come up with actual accurate numbers, between 10 and 100 million in the US alone. And that number has kept increasing. Right? It has become less socially acceptable to perform experiments on beagles and cats, and in particular primates. The number of rats has drastically increased, alongside the number of fishes. So, like Andrews and Monceau say, it's almost a truism to say that humans don't like rats. if we were to list the animals that generate the strongest distates in us, rats would be very near the top. The ones that populate Western cities are viewed as vermin, with such worthless lives that we don't give a second thought to attempts to eradicate them. All right, so how can we move past those conflicts between our different attitudes and between the ways we live and the lives that those animals deserve to live? So it's going to be mainly, and I'm going to be wrapping up actually fairly soon. It's going to be mainly an issue of urban planning and design. Right? So quite simply, we need more green spaces because green spaces are going to be providing more sources of mutually rewarding interactions with urban wildlife and more habitat for such wildlife. But we also need to increase connectivity between habitats. Remember the mountain lions, one of the issues was that you had patches of habitats that were completely disjointed, and that's very bad for those animals. It causes lots of stress, prevents them from mating, engaging in social behavior, hunting, and so on and so forth. So habitat connectivity is going to be key right there. Wildlife crossings and other forms of corridors are going to be ways of increasing connectivity between habitats. And in the way we conceive our cities, including our parks, for instance, we could be more biophilic as opposed to hostile to wildlife, right? So hostile design is a term that's used to describe, for instance, removing benches in parks or designing benches such that homeless people cannot sleep on them. That's a form of hostile design. There's a ton of hostile design that's aimed at excluding animals in cities as well. Right? And it's a fairly depressing fact, both about animals and homeless people, that we tend to treat them in similar ways in urban environments. So emphasizing, like I've said before, the social ecological approach to thinking about cities, but also including consideration of animal welfare, the welfare of individuals themselves in research, education, but also the training of animal handlers, wildlife rehabilitators, and policymakers as well. So these are some nice pictures of wildlife habitat at the outskirts of cities and some wildlife crossings, different kinds of connectivity between different habitats, right? So a bridge, kind of wildlife crossing, corridors, are not exactly crossings, but they are like, streams of green spaces that connect different patches. And what you don't want is those patches to be disjointed like that. But you can even do that in your backyard. So there's tons of ways you can find information online for how to attract wildlife in your garden and make life better for them. All right, just to highlight you don't need to worry about that, the complexity of the decision-making at the level of policy that would be involved in making life better for animals. So I'm not, understating, I don't want to understate the difficulty of resolving many of those conflicts. But so what it would mean in practice many times to take into consideration the welfare of those animals as individuals is sometimes actually taking care of individual animals, orphans, animals that have been impacted by fires, by collisions, that have lost their moms, that have been by vehicles, buildings, and so on and so forth. All right, like I said, you can find a lot of information on how to resolve or prevent some of those conflicts, including in your backyards, online, yes. Contraception and sterilization, different forms of birth control are now investigated. There's a promising form of pest control, so that's actually a pest control company in Charleston, I think, that uses contrapest. To my dismay, the evidence is actually mixed that using those contraceptives as they are now would be overall beneficial to the rats themselves. Of course, it prevents us from having to trap and kill them to control their populations, but apparently they have a lot of side effects on rat health. So to be improved, more research is needed, but there are actually very promising programs of contraception of pigeons, especially in Brussels, that look a lot more promising than the rat thing. These are just some organizations working on urban animals. So that's one in Paris, Paris Animaux Zoopolis, and Wild Animal Initiative in the US. And that's it. If you have any question, you can email me or find me around the blog. And I have to thank one of the sponsors of that research that I did summer and a half ago, the Center for Effective Altruism, which provided me with a generous grant to do some of that research. Thank you.